Lesson 4, Configuring Roles and Permissions. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to meet the following objectives. You should be able to define a permission, describe the rules for applying permissions, create a custom role, and create a permission. Here we're going to look at basically your access control. And the access control system is basically the authorization to perform tasks in your vCenter server and is governed by an access control system. This system enables your vCenter server administrators to basically specify in detail which user groups can perform which task on which objects. The access control system is defined basically four ways. You have your privilege, which defines an action that can be performed. You have a role, which is here, which is a set of privileges. You have your object, which is the target of the action, which you send where you want it to go. And then you have your user and groups, and basically that indicates who can perform what action. Now, with these three here, like once again, I'll make this permission here. And together, a role, a user group, and an object define this permission. When we talk about your users and groups, a user is an individual authorized to log in to an ESXi host or your vCenter server system. You must separately manage these local users that are defined on the vCenter server system and the local system, or basically your local users that are defined on each individual ESXi host. You can also use your Active Directory through your vCenter single sign-on to manage these users and groups for both your vCenter server and your ESXi host. Now, the vCenter server system is not required to belong to your Active Directory domain, but if the vCenter server system is a member of the Active Directory domain, then those user accounts and groups from the domain are available on the vCenter server system at all times. And with that being said, if it is not a part of your domain, then those vCenter server users, they'll use the local Windows users and groups through the local environment and not from your vCenter server environment. So the issue with the vCenter server system when it's a member of the Active Directory domain has some security implications for your vSphere administration. An example of this is anyone with domain administrative privileges in the Active Directory domain has full admin privileges over all the ESXi hosts and your virtual machines that are managed by your vCenter server. Now, these vSphere administrators, they must plan and coordinate your security carefully with your Windows directory, or basically your Windows Active Directory administrators also. And the users who are in the Active Directory group on your ESX admins are assigned your administrator role. And for the ESXi host, you can use the vCenter or your vSphere client or your VMware vSphere API to log in to your Active Directory accounts. Now, on the ESXi host or each ESXi host, you can also use the DCUI and the vSphere ESXi shell to log into your Active Directory account. And only users who are signed in as the administrator role can log in to the DCUI also. Or basically the DCUI vCenter server and the ESXi host to manage their own set of roles. Now, take into consideration here, your roles are managed separately. And a role that is created by your VMware, your vCenter server system, is not visible to the ESXi host if a user logs in directly on that ESXi host. All right, as we see here, we're going to go back to roles, and it's part of that permission. And basically, a role is one or more set of privileges. They allow access to a specific task and is grouped with other privileges related to it. And an example of this is basically your virtual machine power user role consists of several privileges in categories like your data store and your and global. And a role is assigned to a user or group and determines the level of access of that user and group. So let's take what we just said right here about the role being assigned. Now, these roles are not hierarchically organized. No role is superior or subordinate to another role, and all roles are independent of one another. And as you'll see here, you have your privileges, and here's all your privileges within the or your collection of privileges that the users or the groups are allowed to perform. When we discuss the objects within those permissions, a user or a group indicates who can perform the action. Now, the object is the target of that action. Each combination of that user and group and the object must be specified, meaning that the administrator performs basically, or the administrator selects an object from the overall vCenter server inventory and applies a role to be assigned to that object, and then selects the users or the groups in which this permission pertains. Now, a permission can be assigned to any object in the vCenter server inventory. And on this slide, you'll notice that the administrative role was granted to the root user here. So we have the administrator role, and then you have the root user. Now, the combination of user or group plus role can be applied at the vCenter server level. So this permission is allowed on all the data centers in the vCenter server inventory, and it's defined, as you see right here, defined in the vCenter server inventory. And here it shows you've got your lab servers, your ESXi01, you've got the Greg01 VM and the Greg01-2 VM. And basically you're on your Manage tab, Permissions, to get you here to show your user groups, role, and where it's defined at. When assigning your permissions, the role propagation basically is the act of passing along these permissions. And a role can be propagated to its child objects in the inventory. So for each permission, you can decide whether or not the permission propagates down the object hierarchy to all the sub-objects, or if it applies to the original object. A good example of this is you can grant a user the read-only role at the data center level and have the role propagate to the data center's child objects, but then you can grant a more permissive role, such as your VMware power or your virtual machine power user, to a virtual machine in the data center. And as you'll notice here, you have your users and groups, and then you assign the role here. And then you select, and right here is where you can propagate it to your children, and you can view your children where you want to propagate it to, which is basically here. When viewing your roles or assignments that you've created and you've assigned and the roles you've created within those permissions, you can view all the objects to which a role was assigned and all the users or groups who are granted that role. And to view it, you want to click the Usage tab, which is here on the Roles pane. And once you select a role in that roles list, which right here you'll notice that we have the administrator selected, the information panel shows up where it's defined at, which user group, and where it's propagated to. When applying your permissions, this is a pretty good scenario here. As you'll notice here, a permission can propagate down the object hierarchy to all the sub-objects, or it can apply to an immediate object, which here, you've got it right here to the whole hierarchy, or you have it to the immediate object, which is here at prod 03-2. And in addition to specifying where the permissions propagate downward, you can override these permissions set at a higher level by setting different permissions on the basically the lower level object. And user Greg here is given, as you see, we got the user Greg. and which here. He is assigned read-only access in the training data center. Now, this role is propagated to all the child objects except one, and the prod 03-2 virtual machine, in which Greg is the administrator on right here. So basically, Greg has read-only rights to this one, this one, this one. Here, prod 04-2, prod 04-3, he only has read-only rights. But since Greg is the administrator, Greg has rights, administrative rights, to prod 03-2. In this scenario, when a user is a member of multiple groups and these groups have permissions on the same object, basically in that inventory, the user is assigned the union of privileges assigned to the groups for that object. Now, on this slide here, you'll notice you got group 1 and you have group 2. You have members of group 1 and you have members of group 2. So group 1 is assigned the VMware Power On role, which you'll notice here, VMware Power On role, which is a custom role. That role only contains only one privilege, the ability to power on the virtual machine. Group 2 is assigned to take the snapshots role. So, and members of group 2 are Greg and Carla. And you'll notice that Greg has a member of group 1 and group 2, meaning that he can power on the virtual machines and he can take snapshots. But Susan can only take snapshots, or Susan can only power on the virtual machine because she's in group 1, and Carla can only take snapshots because she's only a member of group 2. Now, both of these roles, they propagate to the child objects. Now, with that being said, now you should be able to understand that when you assign these, apply these certain permissions, you can apply to whoever has control in your infrastructure to give them permission to power on, power off that machine, take snapshots, and basically run that certain part of your infrastructure. In scenario 3, when a user is a member of multiple groups with permissions, they can have permissions on these different objects in the inventory. And for each object on which the group has permissions, the same permissions apply as if they were granted to the user directly or direct access. You can only override permissions set at a higher level object by explicitly setting different permissions for the lower level object also. Now, on this slide here, in scenario 3, you'll notice that group 1 right here is assigned the administrator role at the training data center, and group 2 is assigned the read-only role. And if you'll notice here, group 1 is the administrator of the whole training data center. Group 2 only has read-only on prod 03-1, and the permission granted to group 1 is propagated all throughout the child objects. Now, assume that Greg, which we have here in group 1 and group 2, is a member of, or he is a member of group 1 and group 2. Greg has the administrative privileges on the entire training data center, meaning he can control it all at the higher level object, except for the virtual machine named prod 03-1, which is the lower level object. And for this object, Greg gets read-only access because he is part of group 2 and has read-only access for this prod 03-1. All right, scenario 4. Your permissions defined explicitly for the user on an object take precedence over all group permissions on basically that same object. And here you'll notice we have 3 permissions that are assigned to the training data center, which you'll see here, group 1, group 2, and Greg, all on this training data center. All right, so group 1 is assigned the VM Power On role. Group 2 is allowed to take snapshots, and your specific user, Greg, is assigned the read-only role. Now, assume that Greg is a member of both Group 1 and Group 2, which he is, as we see down here. Greg is a member of Group 1 and Group 2, Susan's a member of Group 1, and Carla's a member of Group 2. Now, assume also that the propagation to the child objects is enabled on all the roles. And even though Greg is a member of both Groups 1 and 2, he gets the read-only privilege to the training data center and all the objects under it. Greg gets read-only privilege because explicit user permissions on the object take precedence over all the group permissions on the same object, which is here. Greg only has read-only because it's on the same object here, which is the training data center. Here we're going to discuss your global permissions, and in most cases you apply a permission to a vCenter server inventory object such as your ESXi host or your virtual machine. And when you apply a permission, you specify that a user or a group has a set of privileges called a role on that object. Now, global permissions give a user or group privileges to view or manage all the objects in each of the individual, or basically your inventory hierarchies in your deployment method or in your deployment. And the example here that you see on this slide here basically shows that the global root object, which is here, has permissions over all the vCenter objects, which is here, going down here, and here. Now, this includes your content library. It includes your vCenter server instances, such as your data center folder, your data center, and your tags. Now, your vCenter server permissions, on the other hand, are effective only on objects in the vCenter server instance, which is here. Creating a role. Your virtual machine creator role is one of examples of roles that can be created. As a best practice, you'll define a role using the smallest number of privileges possible so that the security and the control of your environment can be maximized. And you also want to give the roles names that explicitly indicate what each role allows and the purpose, to make it clear when you go basically looking at these roles or assigning these roles or creating the roles. Now, you use folders to contain a scope of permissions. And for an example, you'll want to limit the creation of virtual machines, create a folder in the VMs and templates inventory view, and apply the virtual machine creator role on this folder for the users. Now, the virtual machine creator role, as you see here, it kind of you're simplifying each one here. Your data store, allocate space. Your network, assign a network. So you're simplifying basically the definition of it when you do this. And one that kind of catches my eye here is this kind of goes down a hierarchy, is your virtual machine. You got your inventory and create new. So basically anybody that sees this virtual machine, inventory, create new, you'll know exactly what it's telling you to do or what that role is specifically designed to do. You should be able to meet the following objectives: define a permission, describe the rules for applying permissions, create a custom role, and create a permission.